The sun rose gently over Sydney as Emily packed her small suitcase. She was a university lecturer who had been longing for a holiday, but this trip wasn't entirely her idea. Her younger brother, Nathan, insisted they take their mother, Margaret, on a road trip across the countryside before she grew too old to travel. Nathan's girlfriend, Zoe, also tagged along, adding an extra layer of tension since Margaret didn't really approve of her. The four of them squeezed their bags into Nathan's white SUV, preparing for the long drive toward Queensland. Emily felt uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. Something about this trip seemed unnecessary and forced. Margaret, sitting in the front seat, complained about how things were done in her time and how today's generation lacked respect. Zoe rolled her eyes but kept quiet, while Nathan tried to keep the peace by turning up the radio. As the cityscape disappeared behind them, fields stretched wide and endless, dotted with sheep and windmills. Emily stared out the window, her thoughts drifting, but a shiver ran down her spine for no reason she could name. The road trip had just begun, but already it felt like fate was steering them into something darker than a holiday. The first few hours of the drive went smoothly, with occasional stops at petrol stations and diners along the highway. Margaret kept talking about places she remembered visiting as a young girl, insisting they should take detours to see them again. Nathan smiled politely but reminded her that they had a schedule to keep. Zoe, frustrated, whispered to Emily that the trip would never go smoothly with Margaret around. Emily didn't reply. She was more concerned about the strange mood in the car. Margaret suddenly mentioned an old farmhouse she remembered, claiming it was along a dirt road just off the highway. She described it with such excitement that Nathan reluctantly promised they might check it out later. Zoe muttered under her breath that it sounded like a waste of time. The tension thickened as the SUV rolled deeper into the countryside, where phone signals grew weaker and the towns became smaller. The road ahead looked endless, and yet Emily couldn't shake the thought that they were being pulled somewhere they didn't belong. They stopped at a roadside cafe just outside a dusty town. The cafe was nearly empty except for a truck driver sipping coffee and a couple who sat in silence. Margaret ordered tea but complained that it didn't taste like it used to. Nathan tried to lighten the mood, joking with the waitress, but Zoe kept scrolling on her phone, ignoring everyone else. Emily looked around the cafe and noticed a faded newspaper clipping pinned on the wall. The headline read, "Escaped convicts still at large, police warn travelers." She leaned closer and saw grainy photos of three men, their faces hard and menacing. Before she could say anything, Margaret came over and said in a loud voice that she knew one of the roads nearby had beautiful scenery worth seeing. Emily quickly turned away from the clipping, her stomach tightening. They finished their meal and left, but Emily couldn't shake the image of those faces on the wall. The car ride after lunch was quieter, with Nathan focusing on the road. Margaret began reminiscing again, telling stories of when she was young and how things were better then. Zoe, fed up, finally snapped and asked why Margaret couldn't just relax and enjoy the trip. Nathan scolded Zoe, which made the air in the SUV even heavier. Emily closed her eyes, but her mind kept replaying the newspaper clipping. She wanted to warn Nathan, but she wasn't sure how without sounding paranoid. Suddenly, Margaret exclaimed that she recognized a landmark, a crooked gum tree she remembered from her childhood. She insisted they turn onto a narrow dirt road nearby, claiming it led to the farmhouse she had talked about earlier. Nathan hesitated, but under pressure from his mother, he gave in. The SUV slowed and turned off the main highway, its tires crunching on the rough road. Emily opened her eyes and sighed, realizing this detour was going to change everything. The dirt road stretched on longer than Margaret had promised. Dust swirled behind the SUV as they bumped along the uneven path. Zoe kept complaining that they were wasting fuel and time, but Margaret ignored her. Nathan said they would only drive for 10 more minutes before turning back. Emily watched the bushland blur past the window, thick with trees and shadows. The air inside the car grew hotter, and even the radio had lost its signal. Margaret kept saying they were close, though doubt flickered in her eyes. Finally, they reached an open clearing where the ruins of an old farmhouse stood, broken and overgrown. Margaret clapped her hands, delighted, though the place looked eerie and abandoned. Emily's skin prickled as she stared at the broken windows and sagging roof. Something about the silence around the farmhouse felt wrong, as if they were not alone. They got out of the SUV reluctantly, stretching their legs. Nathan walked around the ruined house, peeking inside cautiously. Margaret insisted it was beautiful, even in ruins, and posed near the broken porch for a picture. Zoe refused to leave the car, saying it looked haunted. Emily stayed close to Nathan, who found old bottles, rusted tools, and a child's toy half buried in the dirt. Margaret laughed as though it was an adventure, but Emily noticed how the wind seemed to stop whenever they spoke too loudly. Out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw movement in the trees, but when she turned, nothing was there. Nathan said it was time to leave, but Margaret kept stalling, saying she wanted to explore a little more. Zoe shouted from the car, telling them to hurry. Emily pulled Margaret's arm gently, urging her back toward the SUV. Just then, a faint crunch of footsteps echoed from the woods nearby. Nathan froze and looked toward the sound. Emily grabbed Margaret's hand, whispering that they should get inside the car. Margaret laughed it off, saying it was probably a kangaroo or a stray dog. Zoe started the engine nervously, urging everyone to hurry up. The footsteps grew louder, and Emily's heart pounded. 3 figures emerged slowly from the shadows of the trees. They were men, dressed in ragged clothes, their faces hard and weathered. Emily's breath caught, she recognized them from the newspaper clipping at the cafe. Nathan stepped in front of his mother and sister instinctively. One of the men, taller than the others, raised his hand as if greeting them. But there was no warmth in his eyes, only cold calculation. The silence of the clearing suddenly felt suffocating, and Emily knew this was no ordinary encounter. The tallest man introduced himself as Jack, though Emily doubted that was his real name. The other 2 men, lean and rough-looking, stood slightly behind him, scanning the SUV. Jack smiled thinly and asked where they were headed. Nathan tried to stay calm, saying they were just passing through. Margaret, to everyone's horror, began chatting openly, telling Jack about their trip and even mentioning they were from Sydney. Emily tugged her mother's sleeve, begging her to stop talking, but Margaret seemed oblivious. Zoe whispered from inside the car that they needed to leave now. Jack's eyes flickered with amusement as he noticed Zoe gripping the steering wheel tightly. He stepped closer, and Emily instinctively stepped back. There was a moment of tense silence before Jack said quietly, "You shouldn't have come down this road." Nathan tried to defuse the situation, laughing nervously and saying they were just leaving. But Jack didn't move aside. The other 2 men spread out slightly, blocking the path to the car. Margaret, confused, asked why they couldn't just let them go. Jack tilted his head and said it wasn't that simple. Emily's throat tightened as she realized how trapped they were. Zoe, still in the driver's seat, revved the engine as if ready to speed off. Jack's gaze snapped to her, sharp and dangerous. Nathan raised his hands, pleading with the men not to cause trouble. Jack's smile vanished, replaced with a hard stare. The clearing grew unbearably silent, and for the first time, Emily felt the full weight of dread pressing on her chest. The air was so tense it seemed like the trees themselves were holding their breath. Jack stepped closer, lowering his voice as he told them he didn't like strangers wandering where they didn't belong. Emily clutched Margaret's hand tightly, wishing she had insisted they never take this road. Nathan tried again to reason with them, promising they would leave immediately. But one of the men muttered that they had already seen too much. Margaret gasped, finally realizing the danger they were in. Zoe honked the horn suddenly, startling everyone, but Jack didn't even flinch. Instead, he motioned for his men to surround the SUV. Emily's pulse raced as she whispered to Nathan that they had to think fast. The holiday trip had officially turned into a nightmare, and there was no guarantee they would make it out alive. Nathan stepped forward bravely, trying to shield everyone from Jack and his men. Emily tugged Margaret closer to her side, while Zoe gripped the steering wheel with trembling hands. Jack studied Nathan with a smirk, clearly enjoying the tension. The two other men moved closer to the SUV, their eyes scanning the bags piled in the back seat. Nathan raised his voice, insisting that they had nothing valuable, just clothes and food. Jack chuckled darkly, replying that people always have something worth taking. Margaret whispered that maybe if they gave them money, they would let them go, but Emily shook her head quickly, sensing it wouldn't be that easy. Zoe's knuckles turned white as she tightened her grip on the wheel, ready to drive off the second she got the chance. Jack's eyes flickered between them, calculating his next move. Emily realized this was a game for him, and they were pieces on his board. Suddenly, Jack leaned closer to Nathan, his face only inches away. He asked whether Nathan considered himself a good man. The question sounded strange and mocking, making Nathan hesitate. Margaret quickly cut in, saying Nathan was the kindest son anyone could have. Jack's expression didn't change, his eyes remained cold and searching. Emily's heart pounded as she realized Jack was testing him, looking for weakness. Zoe whispered through the open window that they should just drive, but Nathan shook his head slightly, fearing a violent reaction. The two men behind Jack shifted impatiently, as if waiting for permission to act. The silence stretched unbearably long. Emily tried to stay calm, but she felt like they were standing on the edge of something irreversible. Jack finally chuckled, breaking the silence, and said, "Let's see how good you really are." Jack ordered one of his men to check the SUV. The man yanked the door open, startling Zoe, who screamed and tried to slam it shut. Jack raised a finger, warning her to stay quiet. Nathan shouted at them to leave her alone, but Jack's cold stare silenced him immediately. Emily gripped Margaret's arm as their bags were pulled out and thrown onto the dusty ground. Clothes spilled everywhere, along with a few personal items. Margaret cried out, begging him not to ruin her things, but Jack ignored her completely. Zoe's phone was snatched from her hand and tossed aside into the dirt. The air grew hotter with tension, every second dragging painfully slow. Emily's mind raced, wondering if there was any way to escape this nightmare. Nathan tried again to reason with Jack, saying they were just a family on holiday and had nothing worth taking. Jack tilted his head, studying Nathan like he was a puzzle. He said calmly that everyone had something to lose, sometimes it wasn't money or things, but people. Margaret gasped and clung tighter to Emily, finally realizing the danger wasn't just about belongings. Zoe muttered angrily under her breath, blaming Margaret for dragging them onto this road. Jack smirked, clearly enjoying the chaos his words were stirring. Emily tried to stay composed, whispering to Nathan to keep him from acting rashly. The two other men laughed cruelly, kicking at the scattered clothes. Jack finally said they would decide what to do after a little chat. His tone made Emily's stomach turn, because she knew no good would come of it. The sun began to sink lower, casting long shadows across the clearing. Jack told them to sit on the ground, motioning with his hand like a teacher giving instructions. Reluctantly, they obeyed, except Zoe, who remained in the driver's seat until one of the men yanked her out roughly. Margaret cried softly, clutching Emily's hand, while Nathan kept glaring at Jack. Jack crouched down in front of them, smiling in a way that was more terrifying than a frown. He asked Emily if she believed people were born good or became good through choices. The question made her shiver, and she didn't answer. Jack tapped his fingers against his knee, saying most people only pretended to be good until they were tested. Nathan muttered angrily that Jack was insane. Jack's eyes flickered dangerously, but instead of reacting violently, he laughed. The sound echoed through the trees, chilling Emily to the bone. Emily tried to think of something, anything, that might distract Jack and his men. She remembered the newspaper clipping and realized these were desperate men with nothing to lose. Margaret, in her nervousness, began rambling about her childhood again, talking about family, church, and how people respected one another back then. To everyone's shock, Jack listened quietly, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Emily thought he might actually soften. Zoe, however, whispered that Margaret was wasting time and making things worse. Jack suddenly asked Margaret if she thought he was a bad man. Margaret froze, caught off guard by the question. She stammered that she didn't know him, but everyone had good in him somewhere. The clearing grew silent as Jack stared at her. For a brief second, Emily thought Margaret's words had reached him. But then Jack smiled coldly, and Emily realized it only amused him. The men began growing restless, pacing around as if waiting for Jack's command. Zoe tried to crawl slowly toward the SUV, but one of them caught her and shoved her back down roughly. Nathan exploded in anger, yelling at them to stop. Jack stepped forward, towering over Nathan, and told him he admired his bravery. But he added that bravery was useless if it couldn't protect the people you cared about. Emily could feel Nathan trembling with suppressed rage, but she squeezed his arm, begging him not to provoke them further. Margaret prayed under her breath, clutching her necklace. Jack suddenly crouched down again, asking Nathan if he was willing to prove he was a good man by making a sacrifice. The words chilled Emily, because she knew Jack was playing a cruel game. Jack's demand was simple but horrifying. He wanted Nathan to choose between staying behind with them or letting his family go. Margaret screamed in protest, insisting they couldn't take her son. Zoe shouted that they should all run, but Emily knew that would only end in disaster. Nathan, torn, looked at Emily with wide eyes, silently asking for advice. Emily shook her head, refusing to let him make such a choice. Jack leaned closer, smirking as he repeated his question. Emily blurted out that there had to be another way, her voice trembling. Jack studied her carefully, as though her reaction intrigued him. He told her she was different, and wondered if she truly understood what goodness meant. The moment stretched unbearably, with everyone frozen in fear. As night began to fall, the bush around them filled with the eerie sounds of crickets and distant birds. The SUV sat like a useless shell, its headlights dim in the growing darkness. Emily's heart pounded louder with every passing second. Jack stood tall, his shadow long in the fading light, and ordered his men to bring rope from their bags. Margaret wailed, begging them not to hurt her children. Zoe cursed under her breath, calling Margaret the reason they were in this mess, which only made things worse. Nathan tried to shield Emily and Margaret, but the men pushed him back roughly. Emily thought about running, but the thought of leaving them behind froze her in place. Jack's calm, deliberate movements made everything worse. He looked like a man in complete control. The situation felt more hopeless with each passing moment. Jack paced slowly, the rope dangling from his hand. He said calmly that life was all about choices and consequences. Emily tried to stall, asking what he really wanted from them. Jack stopped and looked at her with piercing eyes, saying he wanted the truth, whether any of them actually lived the lives they pretended to. His words made Emily's skin crawl, as though he could see right through her. Nathan shouted that Jack was nothing but a criminal, and he would never understand family. For the first time, Jack's face darkened, and the smirk vanished. He grabbed Nathan by the collar, pulling him close, and whispered something Emily couldn't hear. Whatever he said made Nathan's face pale with shock. Emily's stomach twisted as Jack released him and stepped back slowly. The night had only just begun, and it was already turning into something far worse than she had ever imagined. The bushland grew darker, shadows swallowing the clearing as the last light faded. Emily clutched Margaret's trembling hands, her own heart racing. Zoe sat on the ground with anger and fear twisting across her face. Nathan, pale after Jack's whisper, refused to speak, his lips tightly pressed together. Jack ordered one of his men to light a fire, and soon flames flickered in the middle of the clearing, painting their faces orange. The heat of the fire made everything more intense, like a spotlight in the darkness. Margaret begged Jack to let them go, promising they would tell no one. Jack laughed, saying promises were as fragile as dry leaves. The other two men laughed too, their shadows dancing across the broken farmhouse walls. Emily knew this night was far from over. Something terrible was waiting just beyond the firelight. Jack sat calmly near the fire, his voice low as he began talking about his past. He spoke of growing up in broken homes, of betrayal, and of choices that led him to prison. His words came like a confession, but there was no regret in them. Emily listened carefully, sensing he wanted to justify his cruelty. Nathan muttered under his breath that Jack was only making excuses, but Emily silenced him with a sharp glance. Margaret whispered prayers, clutching her necklace so hard her knuckles turned white. Zoe, restless, kept scanning the bush, looking for any gap to escape. Jack noticed her movement and smirked, warning that running would only make things worse. His voice was calm, but the weight of his control pressed on all of them. Emily realized they were trapped not just physically, but psychologically too. The fire crackled louder as Jack turned his attention back to Emily. He asked her whether she believed in forgiveness. The question froze her in place, because she didn't know if he was serious or just playing another cruel game. Margaret quickly answered yes, saying everyone deserved forgiveness. Jack tilted his head and asked softly, "Even me?" The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hiss of the flames. Emily's throat tightened as she finally said, "Yes, if you want it." Jack stared at her for a long moment, and for once his smile faded. His eyes flickered with something unreadable, a shadow of conflict deep inside. But just as quickly, the cold mask returned, and he looked away. Emily realized he might have been human once, but now he had chosen another path. Suddenly, one of the men dragged Nathan forward roughly, shoving him closer to the fire. Margaret screamed, trying to pull him back, but Emily held her tightly. Jack stood and looked down at Nathan, saying choices had to be proven. He told Nathan to admit what he feared most. Nathan shook his head, refusing to play the game. Jack's tone sharpened, warning him not to test his patience. Zoe shouted that this was madness, but one of the men silenced her with a glare. Nathan's chest rose and fell heavily as he finally muttered that he feared failing to protect his family. The words hung in the air, raw and painful. Jack smiled faintly, saying that was a good start. Emily felt tears sting her eyes, because she knew Jack would twist those words against him. Jack crouched in front of Nathan, speaking softly so only he could hear. Emily leaned forward, trying to catch the words, but they were too faint. Whatever Jack said made Nathan shake his head violently in refusal. Jack stood again, looking disappointed but not surprised. He told the others that people always claimed to be good until tested, but most failed. Margaret cried harder, begging him to stop this cruelty. Zoe snapped at Margaret, blaming her detour for everything, which only deepened the tension. Jack raised his hand sharply, silencing them all with a single gesture. The firelight flickered across his face, making his eyes look hollow and endless. Emily's breath caught as she realized Jack wasn't just tormenting him, he was trying to prove something to himself. And that made him even more dangerous. The night dragged on painfully, every second filled with dread. Jack ordered his men to bring more wood for the fire, and they disappeared briefly into the bush. Emily whispered urgently to Nathan that they had to think of a plan before it was too late. Nathan shook his head, saying Jack was too unpredictable. Margaret clutched Emily's arm, insisting they pray harder, but Emily's mind was racing toward action instead of faith. Zoe leaned in and hissed that she was ready to make a run for it, even alone if necessary. Emily begged her to wait, fearing a bullet in the dark. When the men returned, Jack began pacing again, clearly restless. He looked at Emily once more, as if she was the only one he trusted to answer him honestly. Emily felt the weight of his stare pressing down like a heavy stone. She knew he was searching for something he had lost long ago. Jack suddenly asked Emily if she believed people could change, even at the end. The question struck her deeply, and for a moment she forgot her fear. She said quietly that she believed change was possible, but only if someone truly wanted it. Jack's eyes narrowed, studying her as if testing the truth of her words. Margaret eagerly agreed, saying redemption was always possible with faith. Zoe rolled her eyes, muttering that they were wasting time talking philosophy with a madman. Nathan kept his gaze low, his fists clenched tightly in his lap. Jack slowly crouched down beside Emily, his face only inches away. His voice dropped to a whisper, asking if she thought he was beyond change. Emily's heart pounded, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. Her answer would determine everything. Emily whispered, "No one is beyond change, not even you." For the first time, Jack didn't smirk or laugh. His eyes searched hers, as if trying to find proof that she believed what she said. The clearing grew so quiet that even the fire seemed to wait. Margaret nodded furiously, supporting Emily's words. Nathan raised his head, his eyes glistening with a strange mix of fear and hope. Zoe shook her head in disbelief, whispering that they were wasting precious chances to escape. Jack stood slowly, looking conflicted. He turned his back to them, staring into the dark bush. For a fleeting second, Emily thought he might actually let them go. But then one of his men muttered something impatiently, breaking the fragile moment. Jack's face hardened again as he turned back toward them. Jack barked at his men to bring Nathan to his feet. They dragged him roughly, forcing him to stand by the fire. Margaret cried out, clutching her chest as Emily tried to calm her. Jack told Nathan this was his final test. He demanded that Nathan prove whether he truly valued his family more than his pride. Nathan, shaking, asked what that meant. Jack smirked and said he would find out soon enough. Emily stood quickly, shouting for Jack to stop, but one of the men shoved her back down. Zoe cursed under her breath, helplessly clenching her fists. The fire roared higher as Jack raised his hand signaling his men. Emily realized something irreversible was about to happen. Jack leaned close to Nathan, whispering words none of the others could hear. Nathan's eyes widened in horror, his lips trembling. He shook his head, but Jack gripped his shoulder tightly, forcing him to face the fire. Margaret screamed, begging Jack to take her instead, but Jack ignored her. Emily tried to break free, but the men kept her pinned. Zoe shouted at Nathan to stay strong, though her own voice was breaking. Jack finally stepped back, releasing Nathan, who sank to his knees in shock. The silence that followed was unbearable. Emily stared at Nathan, desperate to know what Jack had said. But Nathan's eyes were distant, as if his spirit had already broken. Jack turned slowly toward Emily, his expression unreadable. The clearing was deathly quiet, the firelight flickering across everyone's faces. Jack stepped closer to Emily again, his eyes fixed on hers. He said softly that she had spoken with honesty, unlike the others. His words sent a chill through her spine, because she didn't know if it meant safety or danger. Margaret sobbed uncontrollably, clinging to Nathan's arm. Zoe sat rigid, her jaw clenched, her anger barely hiding her fear. Jack crouched down in front of Emily, asking one final question: if goodness is real, then why do people like me exist? Emily's lips trembled, but she forced herself to answer. She said that goodness still existed, but people chose darkness because it felt easier than facing their pain. Jack's eyes flickered strangely, a shadow of doubt appearing. For a moment, Emily thought she saw humanity in him again. But it was gone in an instant, swallowed by the firelight. The night ended in a sudden storm of chaos. Jack's men grew impatient and began shouting, demanding they finish what they started. Jack raised his hand, silencing them, his face caught between two worlds. violence and something Emily's words had stirred. The fire hissed as the wind picked up, scattering sparks into the dark bush. Margaret clung to Nathan and cried out to God for mercy. Zoe whispered urgently to Emily that this was their only chance to escape. And then, in a moment that felt like fate itself had intervened, headlights appeared in the distance, another car driving down the dirt road. Jack's head snapped toward the light, his jaw tightening. Emily's breath caught as she realized they were no longer invisible in the dark. The men panicked, unsure whether to run or fight. Jack stood frozen, staring at Emily one last time. His eyes burned with something she couldn't name, anger, regret, or maybe the faintest trace of redemption. And then, with the sound of the approaching engine, everything shattered into chaos.